Hey, thanks for joining me. So today I'm going to talk to you about the Moza Aircross 2 gimbal. And this is a gimbal that has already been reviewed by a lot of people on YouTube. So if you want the basic specs and what this does, go check out those other reviews, then come back and hear my opinion. Because basically, all I want to talk to you about here is my opinion of the performance of the gimbal. Because I feel like it has a lot of amazing features and it's almost there, but it's not there. And that's what I want to talk about. So what do I mean? Well, let's start with the motor power of the gimbal. One thing I noticed when calibrating my camera on this gimbal, because it has an auto-tune feature that automatically tunes the gimbal to the weight of your camera, is that the motors were regularly at 100 after tuning, which means that the motor power was like cranked all the way up after auto-tuning to the weight of my camera. Even with this setup, which is the 35 f1.8 on the A7 III, which is not a super heavy setup, the motors were at 100 for at least like one or two of the axes. Because, you know, this is a motor, and this is a motor, and this is a motor, and each of these can get cranked up to 100. At least one of them would be at 100, even after tuning just for this fairly light camera. So that makes me a little worried. That makes me think, if this setup is already stressing out the motors, how's it going to be when I use an even heavier setup? Are they going to be able to keep up? So yeah, when I auto-tuned it with an even heavier lens, like the 16-35 f4, I found that two of the axes, I think it was the tilt axis and the roll axis, were at 100 after auto-tuning. So 2 out of my 3 axes were at full power, which is not very encouraging, because what if I add a follow focus or something else to this lens on this camera? So as usual, I've done a lot of walking around, a lot of testing with the gimbal, and I'm going to start showing you some of the footage that I got here. Now, as you can see, this footage is generally pretty usable looking, actually. So it's not bad with the 35 f1.8. I was able to get pretty good performance out of the gimbal. Also, disclaimer, I did use steady shot when I was shooting with this lens. I always use steady shot. Steady shot is always on every time I use a gimbal. So when I do my tests, because I'm testing specifically to see if I can use the gimbal for my style of shooting with my gear, then I'm gonna leave the steady shot on just so I can get results that mirror a real world shoot for me. So with steady shot on, I was getting pretty usable results overall with this camera and lens combination. But if you look really close at some of these shots, you can start to see my footsteps a little bit. And that little bit of footstep jitter usually comes from the motors being a little too weak, or from the tuning of the motors being dialed down a little too much. And that's what has me worried here, because even with my steady shot on, even walking slowly and walking carefully, I was still seeing a little bit of jitter in my footsteps. So these are the fine-tuned things that may or may not concern you, depending on how perfect your footage needs to be. So then I switched it up and I used a lighter weight lens, which had OSS built in, the 35 f1.8 OSS, not the same 35 f1.8. This is the APS-C 35 f1.8, which is about half the size and has image stabilization in the lens. So now I've got lens stabilization, I've got camera stabilization, and I've got the gimbal all working together. And with that lens, I feel like I got much smoother results overall. So lesson there is, maybe this gimbal's best with APS-C cameras, or cameras that have both in-body stabilization and lenses that have stabilization. I also got pretty good results with the 16-35 f4 lens on here. Even though this is a heavier lens, it has OSS in the lens, it has stabilization in the lens, which definitely helped. And I feel like the wider angle of the lens also made maybe tiny jitters a little bit less noticeable. Although it still wasn't perfect. It still wasn't as good to me as, for instance, the Moza Air 2 was, with the same lens on the same camera. Another problem I had initially with this gimbal, which I actually have solved, is I got some really violent motor vibrations at certain angles. This would cause vibrations, or like this, if it's like off to a weird side angle like that. When I was first using the gimbal, I got just crazy vibrations from that. So basically the way you fix those vibrations is you go into the filter setting here and you slowly start increasing the filter for a pan, roll, and tilt, because it can be controlled individually. And you just play around with it until the vibrations go away. And I found that it wasn't really that hard. It only took me about 2 minutes. So that was a totally fixable problem. But if you do get this gimbal and you do get vibrations, don't worry. There is a way to fix those. Okay, now I want to talk about my favorite part of the gimbal. That is this dial right here. This dial is awesome. This is an incredible interface to use to control the gimbal, because all I do is I just press this and that enables or disables the pan. I press this, enables or disables the tilt, and I press this, enables or disables the roll. I turn this, increases the speed of response, the quickness that it responds, and turn this, it slows down the speed of response. Now this wheel has a whole lot more functions than what I just showed you there, but I'm not really going to go into those because what I showed you is the most important to me. And the reason it's the most important is because it allows me to adjust settings on the fly as I'm shooting without opening up an app or without having to reprogram the gimbal in any complicated way. Like let's say I want roll follow and I also want pan follow, but I don't want tilt follow. With this gimbal, I can just create that with a few clicks of some buttons, and here we are. All right, now we're following my roll up to 45 degrees, and we're following the pan. But the tilt does not follow. Boom, done. I wish every gimbal could be this easy, because every shot I do is different, and I don't want to have to bring out my phone, open up an app, go into the settings of the app, reconfigure stuff, close out the phone, and pick up the gimbal, because by then, the shot's lost. Whereas with this one, I can operate tactically. In the field, I can say, okay, I'm going to shoot that. I need these follows. Boom, it's set, it's done. That is great. Another great way for using this function is that you can disable the follow during a shot. Let's say I'm panning in a shot, and then at some point, I want to lock off the pan and run straight forward. And I don't want the camera wiggling around as I run. But then later on, I want to re-engage the pan in the same shot and continue panning. With this gimbal, a move like that can be easily achieved. And you don't have to hold down a trigger in order to do it. That's one thing I really don't like about some of the other gimbals. I don't like having to hold down a trigger to lock everything off because I'm not always holding my gimbal just like this. Sometimes I'm holding it in some weird way where my finger's not on the trigger, or maybe it's on, I don't know, like a monopod. It's much easier to just tap a button and let go than it is to consistently hold down a trigger in order to lock things off. So these are little functional things that matter a lot when I'm out in the field. Now, let's talk about this. Focus wheel. Pretty much every gimbal seems to have one these days. I bet you're not using yours to focus your shots. What you can do here on the Moza Aircross 2 is you can reassign this to a lot of different functions. And for me, the most useful remapping is pan and tilt, because that way I can precisely control the amount that I pan without having to use my wrist, because sometimes it's easier just to turn a dial and pan consistently than it is to try to turn my wrist perfectly and achieve a perfectly consistent pan that way. But there's a caveat here. If the gimbal is moving and your wrist is also kind of turning around and around like that, then that will somehow disable this. So in other words, the more torque you're putting on the gimbal, like that, the less functional this becomes. It sort of stalls out. You'll be cranking this and trying to make it pan as you walk around, and the camera will just keep looking straight forward. And then the moment you stop walking, it'll return to its normal functionality. Another minor annoyance here is that the wheel cannot be used in conjunction with the follow functions. So if I have tilt follow enabled, and then I try to use the wheel and pan while I'm tilting, see, it's not tilting anymore. Then, when I stop using the pan, tilt follow resumes. That's really annoying for me, and it cuts down on the ways that I can use this wheel function. And that's what I'm kind of talking about, where I feel like the gimbal's almost there, but it's not there. It's got so many features that would make it the perfect gimbal if they were implemented practically. And they're almost practical, but they're not quite practical yet. And it drives me crazy, because as I'm out there shooting, trying to get a certain shot, I'm running up against these little hiccups that prevent my shot from looking as smooth as I want it to be. And then I eventually just have to give up on the shot and do something simpler instead. Okay, so next up, I tried out the iFocus M follow focus attachment. So I tried it out with my 7 Artisans 35mm f2 lens because it's tiny and because these manual lenses work a lot better with follow focus units than the focus by wire lenses, the new Sony lenses do, just because they respond more accurately. So here's the thing about these follow focus units. I don't think they're actually practical in most real-world scenarios because it's just so goddamn hard to focus with this little wheel. Now the Aircross 2 doesn't have any sort of wireless video transmission, and I didn't want to hook up a big external HDMI monitor, so I was looking off the back of the camera and trying to achieve proper focus using this dial. And even with focus peaking enabled, it was just impossible to get a proper focus throw. And you may say, okay, well, you just need to use a bigger monitor, which may be partially true, but here's the thing. I've shot for many years using manual focus on cameras and hand cranking this, and I've been able to hand crank just fine and achieve focus just fine doing it that way. Looking off the back of the camera, I've been able to achieve very fine focus very accurately. So I don't think that's the only thing at play here. So I thought about this issue a lot actually over the last couple days as I've been trying to make this thing work. And what I realized is that there's something critical missing from this focus wheel, which is hard stops. So to demonstrate what I mean, I'm going to turn the lens to infinity with this wheel. Boom, we just hit infinity. Now, here's the problem. I can continue to turn the focus wheel as much as I want. So let's say I've marked my focus here on the wheel. See, there's a little mark there. I don't want to hit that. Well, if I accidentally hit infinity and then turn a little too far, my mark is now off because I can just keep spinning this indefinitely, and then all my alignments change. Same thing goes for minimum focus, by the way. Once you hit, minimum, you can keep spinning this. So there's no hard stops. In other words, I'm not forced to stop turning this wheel at any point, so my markings will never stay consistent. And even if you're not physically marking the wheel, there's a muscle memory aspect. Like let's say I determine, okay, I need to turn that much to achieve proper focus. Well, I can run into the same problem if I turn past infinity. Oh, now I lost my mark and I have to kind of go back and guess again. So I haven't worked with a lot of follow focus units, but I think the professional units usually have hard stops so that you have a hard point past which you can no longer turn. And I wish that could be implemented here. And the way I was thinking you could do it is you could just put it in a switch. So basically, once you've set your focus marks or you calibrated your lens or whatever, you flip the switch to enable the hard stop. So then there will be a point that you can no longer turn past. So it basically only gives you as much turn as the lens is able to turn. And another factor that makes it so hard to pull focus while walking with the gimbal is that the gimbal's distance from the subject will vary so much. Even if I rehearse a shot, I say, okay, I'm gonna walk from here over to here, and I try to set my focus at the beginning, then try to set my focus at the end, and then I say, okay, I just need to turn it that much. Well, as I'm walking, I realize that I tend to not hit the exact same marks every time I go back and forth, especially if I'm doing a bigger move, like walking all the way across a room. It's just really hard to end up with the gimbal in the right exact spot. So that's not really the fault of the gimbal makers, but it's something to keep in mind if you have this fantasy of throwing on an f1.8 lens and manually pulling focus all the time. Now, aside from having hard stops, there is one feature that I think maybe could be added to the Aircross 2 that could make focus easier. And I'm not sure if this is already in here because the menu is actually pretty dense, but I didn't find it. And that is the ability to program a point A and a point B to focus and have it automatically move from point A to point B. I would set my focus at the beginning of my shot, then I'd go and set my focus at the end of the shot. And then I'd go back to the beginning and I would hit a button, and then as I walk, this follow focus would automatically turn and rack focus to the second position. So if I could plot like 3 or 4 focus points, that would be even more amazing because then at the beginning of the shot, I could say, okay, that's my focus. Then I could, walk halfway and say, now I'm going to focus on this person's face. And then I could walk to the end of my shot and say, okay, that's where it needs to end up. And as I'm walking, I could continue to trigger the different focus points. And that would allow me to control when it does the rack focuses, because maybe I'm not going to walk at exactly the same speed every time I do the shot, or maybe the subject is going to be moving a little bit differently. So that's just a thought of something that maybe could be implemented here that would make the focus a whole lot more usable. I would love for somebody to prove me wrong about the usability of these follow focus units. If you are using your follow focus successfully to pull focus on moving targets with a moving camera, like let's say you can film somebody walking around a room at f1.8 and you can keep them in sharp focus while you walk around with the gimbal, then I want to see that. Please post a comment with the link and show me your footage. And if I get any really great examples, then I'll talk about them in another video here. Okay, one more little gripe I want to talk about with the Aircross 2. The gimbal itself is actually quite lightweight. If you just hold the gimbal with no camera attached, it feels pretty light. But you have to use this cage to mount the camera. And this metal cage adds a lot of weight. And the quick release is another attachment on top of the cage, and that adds even a little bit more weight. And the quick release works great, by the way. I do like it because it's very easy to put the camera in. It locks in place. You retain your balance. You don't have to rebalance it at all. So the functionality here is great, but the weight that it adds to the gimbal is noticeable. And a lot of people say, yeah, just hit the gym, whatever, blah, blah, blah. It's a few extra ounces, no big deal. Well, yeah, it's no big deal if you're holding your gimbal like this all the time and just getting very basic shots. Once you try to do something even a little more advanced, like let's say extending the gimbal out and getting an angle like this, then all of a sudden, the weight that was very comfortably being directed straight down is now being torqued out at a 45-degree angle. And so there's all this weight that's going on my forearms right now that I didn't have to deal with before, like this. So every little ounce out there matters a lot more when I'm doing these shots. And I do those kinds of shots all the time. And I do crazy gimbal moves, you know? That's part of my filmmaking technique. So if you don't do crazy gimbal moves, then of course that won't really apply to you. But it's a big, big deal for me. So I try to reduce my weight as much as possible. You know, I view this as a high performance vehicle, and I want to make it as light and as fast and as agile as possible. And I don't like comparing gimbals a lot, but in terms of weight and weight distribution, this feels a lot heavier overall in everyday use than the Zhiyun weebill-s does. And that's not just because of how much it actually weighs, it's because of the way the weight is distributed. The Aircross 2 is very top heavy, all my weight's up here. So when my arms are down here and the weight's up there, then the weight's far away from my arms, and that means whenever I go out at an angle, I'm really feeling it. Whereas if the gimbal was weighted a little bit differently, if it was balanced differently, then it wouldn't be nearly as stressful on my arms as I shoot. Okay, so there's just one more thing I'm going to mention here, and that is inception mode on this gimbal, which is another feature that is so close to being awesome, but it's not quite there for me. And I really, really want this to work. So the way you enable inception mode is great. It's just 3 taps on the right side there, and then boom. So now you can hold the gimbal like this, and not only will it follow your roll as you go around, but it will also continue to follow your tilt and your pan. So you can do really complicated moves like this and do those FPV moves that I love doing. And that's all fine and good, that's great, and the operation is very smooth. The problem is, when I'm walking in inception mode, it no longer stabilizes as well with a straight walk. Like, it doesn't stabilize out my footsteps as well. I see a sort of rocking, wobbling going on as I'm walking. And that's not because it's following the roll of my hand, it's because the motors just aren't operating as efficiently as they should. Okay, so those are a lot of gripes that I have with the Aircross 2, but I'm only complaining because I want Moza to watch this video and make this as good as it can be, because they are on the cusp of having a fantastic gimbal here if they can address some of these issues and make it function as well as it should. And if you're the type of person that's not going to be using a lot of these other weird functions like inception mode, or if you don't need an external follow focus, or if you don't need to be panning with the wheel while you're tilting, okay, then maybe none of these apply to you and this gimbal's ready to go. It's perfect for you. So don't let my opinion be the only opinion that you take into consideration. Of course, watch other reviews, see what they have to say. Otherwise, hope you enjoyed my thoughts on this gimbal. I will see you next time.